Alright, one take. The Amazing Digital Circus, the last act, just came out today in cinemas. So I watched it in cinemas during the first screening, and I'm just going to give my very general thoughts on what happened in the episode, trying to prevent any spoilers of what happened in the episode. So I'm going to give it in terms of, I won't directly say what's happening in the episode. That's probably the best way to sum up. But I think, overall review, what did I think of the film? I think it was decent. I think the end finale, because the finale is part episode 8, part episode 9, and some other bits they throw in there. I believe that episode 9 in particular did an interesting end, did an interesting conclusion. I have grievances with what they did with the plot, but I think overall I did enjoy the finale. It was decent. I think one of the big, just quickly go into criticisms, because I want to kind of cover things I enjoyed, things I didn't like. Criticisms. It was just the fact that episodes, you have to sit through episode 8. I love episode 8. It's a great episode, but it kind of felt like a drag watching it, because I've been kind of separated from the fandom for a bit. So I watched the episodes, and I kind of did a rewatch and stuff. So re-sitting through episode 8 was alright. I mean, it's just episode 8. It's a good episode. It's probably one of the best, or probably my favorite of this series as a whole, apart from like episode 3. I think it's episode 3 with Kinga and Pomni's quite interesting interaction. You also got the Jax crash out episode, that was quite cool. So, episode 9 in particular, I think it was decent. Episode 8, being as a part of it, for, I guess, there's justification for being a film, it's alright. But, you know, I think they did a good right job, but the thing is, with the film in particular, it didn't feel like a film. It was more of just watching a TV show on the big screen, which is good. I liked seeing that, because being that big and blown up, seeing all the different things that you typically see on a smaller screen, seeing it on a huge cinema screen, you can see the detail in the background. I was noticing things in episode 8 that I hadn't really paid attention to before, like background props or characters or, you know, characterizations. So I think that was quite interesting. But I think, just to kind of go with this review, I want to kind of mix in general thoughts and then kind of go over characters and what I think they did good or bad, like conclusion-wise, in a generic term. Do I think they summed up characters in an interesting way? So before going into this final episode, this is what I knew beforehand, so this is not spoilers. They said, so like Gooseworks or, you know, people involved in the project, they were going to go more into Jax's backstory, as what this episode was kind of going to go into. So now that I've said that, I'm not going to do anything spoiler-wise, because obviously it ain't come out on YouTube yet, so I'm going to be mindful. The plot, I think it was interesting. I said to my friend after watching it that this is like the best bad ending. What I mean by that is that it's not the conclusion itself isn't supposed to be super satisfying, but I would say it's like the best of a bad ending. So you're not seeing, it's not like you're not being completely satisfied, you're not being completely unsatisfied. You're getting a nice middle ground. And I think that was an interesting way of finishing the project as a whole. So it's not, you're not going to go into it and then watch episode 9 and be like, oh, this is the worst piece of media ever, it really ruined the finale. I think it did a decent job. But as I suspect, there's going to be people who are going to criticize, or they're going to be very, very negative on the episode. I think one of the things that is a good criticism for this episode is that I felt this a bit with other episodes, is the emotion. So how they handle emotions, the emotional scenes. There's kind of a strange balance. I don't think in the beginning part of the episode that the emotional exploration was as balanced as before, because this episode kind of just goes in guns a-blazing. And that doesn't mean that there's, I'm not gonna confirm or deny what that means. But okay, avoiding the spoilers. But I think the first, I guess, third of the episode 9, which is like an hour, the exploration of the emotional, in my opinion, was a bit off. But I think they had a decent conclusion. And now I'm going to go over my thoughts of like the show in general, of the different characters. So it's going to be my opinion of the entire show in particular, and what I think they did a good job or not, especially in episode 9, but in general, because I don't want to spoil what happens in episode 9. So I've got the popcorn tin that I'm just going to quickly turn around and give my review. Okay, so I think Pomni's character in this episode, they took it in an interesting way. They took an interesting angle how they dealt with Pomni and her. She's kind of like, as she's been through this show, she's sort of that, she's the way to explore different things. So her character is essential for kind of getting to moments, or, you know, having interesting interactions with different characters. She's enabling the plot to move forward, and you see that similar with like Kane, in particular, like episode 8. So I think with Pomni's character in episode 9, they did an interesting exploration. I wouldn't say it's the best of the show, how they dealt with Pomni's character, but I do enjoy how it concluded, because it wasn't what I was expecting, and it wasn't, you know, worst case scenario, best case scenario. It was a nice middle ground, which it shouldn't be. I don't think that might be considered a spoiler, but I think because it's so generic what I'm saying, you don't even know what my personal opinion on what a good and bad ending would be, and I'm not going to explore that then, so that kind of gives a vagueness to it. Kinga's character, I think they gave him an interesting aspect in this episode, in episode 9 in particular. He had an interesting role in it. I wouldn't say it was one of the primary roles, but he had an interesting role that kind of, it's a nice continuation of his character and sort of how he's been explored in the show in particular. I think when it came down to it, episode 9 did an interesting exploration, but it didn't do anything that was completely surprising. Ragatha's character, I think they did Ragatha's character pretty well, apart from my complaint, which is to do, actually I won't go into that, but her character, I think she had a nice conclusion. She didn't do any. It was an interesting continuation from the whole series as a whole of Ragatha's character. I think it had an interesting. I should probably figure out a new word for that. It had a fascinating exploration, one could say. Jax's character. So this was one of the things going into it, knowing that this is not a spoiler by the way, that Jax's character is going to be explored. They're going to do something interesting with his character. As an episode as a whole. This is the thing about pacing. I think pacing is also something that could be criticized for this episode. So especially with the emotional aspect of things. I do feel at some point it was just sort of, in order to, because the last episode they have to conclude the series, they have to provide a satisfying enough conclusion. So the property isn't, you know, my cow. The property itself isn't ruined, so I think the ending was it found a nice middle ground, so it's not going to have that sort of that finale where people hate it because it ruined the whole what the rest of the show was trying to aim to do, or people were expecting the show was aiming to do. So the creator, obviously, they cared about the ending. So pacing and emotions, I feel the first third of episode 9 didn't do particularly. It wasn't finely tuned as some of the other episodes. I think it does pick it up going into the second third and then the third third. There's a pretty funny moment in the episode. It's not all just doom and gloom. There is some interesting parts, especially with the exploration of certain characters in this episode. Going back to Jax, I think his conclusion as a character, I feel they handled it well. They did what I was hoping would happen. I'm not going to tell you what I was hoping to happen, but an interesting thread through the series is Jax a redeemable character? Can this man, is he a redeemable person, or is he irredeemable? And I think this episode handled that particularly well. So there's a conclusion on whether he's a redeemable person or not, sort of, in my eyes anyway. I think they did justice to the character with how they dealt with what occurs in episode 9 with him in particular. That's everything on the tin. They've missed out Gangle, which is funny. So Gangle's character, I liked Gangle's character in this episode. I don't think much occurs in terms of, I mean, they do wrap up a lot of plot points in this episode for all the characters. And Gangle's character in particular, there's some interesting moments. I think there was a very nice moment involving one of the Ragatha's characters. There was a nice moment involving Ragatha's character in the episode. I won't go into specifics of what it is. I think Jax had a nice part in the episode as well. So they did that. They did, at least those two characters, I think they did pretty well development-wise for episode 9. Zubul, I don't think is on here either. So Zubul's character, it's a nice continuation. I think Zubul's character as a whole on this show I think they did justice to the character. So episode 9 really succeeded in, I guess, threading plot points that have been built throughout the show and giving a satisfying conclusion to some and some others an unsatisfying conclusion. And what I mean by unsatisfying is that they haven't gone for one of the extremes. They haven't gone for completely worst case scenario or completely best case scenario. They kind of gone for a middle ground, which I think is a nice way to tie in this series, because this series is supposed to be delving into more of a psychological element of like existential crisis and all these different interesting topics, and for the conclusion it did a decent job. For the last act in particular, so when you're watching it from start to finish, the intro is quite hilarious. Then you go into episode 8, then you go into episode 9 and you have a conclusion. And the formatting, I think, was it was formatted decently. I wouldn't say it didn't feel like a movie per se. It felt like watching the final episode, which I could watch anywhere, but watching it particularly in a cinema was a unique experience because you have all these amazing people surrounding you. Some interesting fans. There was a lot of cosplayers, which was nice to see. Very nice cosplay. And I feel like that's probably going to wrap up this non-spoiler review. So it's about 5 minutes, but I kind of went into very obscure, I guess, representations of what I think of the different characters and how their plot points were wrapped up. Also, just to say as well, as a whole, as a series as a whole, you also got to include Kane and Bubble. Bubble's character throughout the entire show, I think, was a very funny comedic character, which had a very serious moment in episode 8 in particular. And I think Bubble's character throughout all of the episodes was a very well-designed character, a well-implemented character. Kane's character, I think, throughout the entire show, so give my opinion of Kane as the entire show, I guess this is probably where I'm most, not disappointed, but like this was one of the areas where I would say wasn't the most satisfying conclusion. So seeing Kane throughout this show, seeing his character and how it developed, I felt myself, I don't know if you've watched all of the episodes and you got the complete package, you understand what the entire plot is. Kane's character, I feel, had a sort of unsatisfying ending through the entire series. And that's not just me pointing specifically to the last act. I just feel like, as a general thing, Kane's character had, for me, probably one of the most unsatisfying conclusions. And when I say unsatisfying, I'm not saying for me, that's just they haven't picked an extreme. They've picked a middle ground for his character through the entire series, and he's a good tragic character. So, sort of like Jax. Jax is also quite a tragic character in terms of, what you see, especially if you're looking at the whole product, how he is abusive to a lot of people. That's how he deals with, especially from episode 1 to 8. That's how he deals with being in the circus. So yeah, I don't know who's gonna listen to this, but if it somehow helps or you found it somewhat entertaining, then thanks. I hope you have a nice day. If you didn't find it entertaining, I also hope you have a nice day, because it's a decent day today. I mean, the weather is not particularly nice where I'm at right now, but I feel having the conclusion, having watched the final thing, and now I can review the entire series, it's an interesting, very fascinating series. I enjoyed it. And I'm just now going to go from the focus on the last act to now just my general thoughts. When I was getting into the show, first couple episodes, I found it quite a cringe show. It's like me with anime. I hope I don't offend a load of people, but it's my opinion. But when it comes to lots of animes, I find it a lot of the time I'm cringing. But with this series, after rewatching it, I enjoyed what they did. I didn't find it as cringe. And I did enjoy this properly, and I did enjoy the film. I look forward to Game Oververse that came out, another series. Yeah. Alright, enjoy the rest of your day. See ya.